Principal Perkins, can you hear us? Okay, great.
All set. All right. Good afternoon. We've scheduled no national alerts for this meeting. We'll try to keep it to a dull roar. We will, let's start with the roll call and declarations, and then we'll move into, slight tweak to the agenda, but we'll review it at that point. Does that sound like a good place to start? All right, I'm Jeff Harris with Solaire Home Builders. I have a potential conflict. I'm going to go to Morgan.
Sir, I am Morgan Greenwood, Central Oregon Builders Association. I too have a potential conflict.
Kathy Austin, architect, representing Affordable Housing Advisory Committee. I don't believe I have any conflict whatsoever.
Dan Jenkins, landscape architect with Sarah Architects, potential conflicts.
Sue Gordon-Hammer, representative of the Planning Commission, no conflicts.
Lucy Samuel, Central Oregon Land Watch, no conflicts.
Covey Chauncey, representing the Environment and Climate Committee, no conflicts.
Sarah Hanson, and Parks and Rec, potential conflicts.
Jim Roberts at large, no conflicts.
Corey Bittner with Polish Family Companies, potential conflict. And I will say I have to leave about 10 minutes early, so I'm not getting up because I'm mad at somebody.
But if it's before 1:50, we could read something into it then. Would it be okay if we?
Sure.
Hi, Gina.
Hi, Gina Franzosa, River West Neighborhood Association. Still look at my name tag. Potential conflict.
Aaron Johnson, a member of large, no conflicts.
Chris Madison, arborist, potential conflicts.
And I don't think Brett, doesn't like Brett has joined remotely. If he does join, we'll pause for a second to allow him to declare. Okay, so this meeting, we're going to discuss, we're going to get into the meat of mitigation as the main assignment we have today, which we'll talk about shortly. And then if we, now I'm going to say if, I'm going to say when we tackle mitigation, then we'll get into some discussion about whether we should exempt certain lot sizes from the path that we've laid out. So that we can keep things moving. That's, yeah, I had another thought and it's gone, so we'll skip it. Eric, we just did roll call. Do you want to go ahead?
Eric Huffman, potential conflict of interest.
Thank you. Welcome.
Very good.
All right, Pauline, I'll let you review where we are.
Okay, so just a reminder on the council scope, we are on number 4 of the task to consider alternatives to preserving trees, including tree replacement and fee in lieu. So as Jeff said, we're going to talk about tree replacement for the majority of this meeting and then get to minimum lot size possibilities.
I remember my other thing, which was we don't have public comments scheduled for today because we just did some straw polling last week, and we know that it's the multi-dimensional chessboard of figuring out the percentages and then mitigation and then fee in lieu to try to make sure that the incentives align to our goals. So when we have something that we think, okay, we're now fully reviewing it, then we'll make sure that we have public comment time.
Yep, and we can still receive public comments through email, and then if I receive them, I still upload them to City View for everyone to take a look at. So the recommendations today using our flow chart, just a reminder. So at the last meeting, Renee put this flow chart together, and it's kind of working our way down to first trying to preserve the priority trees, then preserving overall DBH, and then to mitigation. So the recommendations, although not final right now, are preserving priority trees that are 20 inches or greater, and that would be 20% of those trees. And then if we were to, if a developer can't do that, then they would have the option of preserving 25% of the overall DBH, and that's 6 inches or greater on all kinds of trees. And if they can't do that, then we get into the tree replacement and then the fee in lieu, or a combination of preserving DBH, replacement on site, and mitigation.
which is where the complexity lies, right? So it's like, okay, we don't have a whole lot or any priority trees. We're saving 22% of the total DBH. And then we need to cover that remaining 3%. That's where it starts to get a little bit sticky. It's easy at a theoretical level, but then when you think about a site with no priority trees, or really weird location of all those, the DBH, and that's right where the transportation system plan says a big road has to go, or like there's potential confusion there. So that's the foundation I want to lay for the conversation, which is we're trying to both keep it simple and actually have a recommendation to give, which is our job.
And then Kavi at the last meeting, since we made some recommendations on the 20 and 25%, he asked, and there seemed to be interest from the group, so I put it together for everybody about the overall, so I can see my screen. Instead of looking at it project by project and whether or not they're meeting the 20 or 25%, if we just added up all the trees that are larger than 20 inches or all the DBH, where does this stand? Like if you're looking at it, not that this represents the city, but it represents an entire number versus just project by project. So when we look at the trees 20 inches or larger, the actual amount of trees combined with all the project that are 20 inches or larger is 135 trees out of all these projects. The actual preservation of them is 33. So out of the 135, 33 trees that are 20 inches or larger were proposed to be saved. And if you look at our recommendation of 20%, then you would see that the actual preservation is actually exceeding what is taking place if we say 20%. So today we're actually getting more than the recommendation that we are proposing at 20%. So just keep that in mind. Bobby?
Could I raise a point towards that? So I just wanted to, I guess my understanding is that this committee was formed by City Council with the task because committee members were worried about the amount of trees that are being cut, and there's no code that's objective and clear and standardly applied across the city. And I guess my concern when I look at those numbers is that I feel like the code and the percentage we agreed on 20%, if most developers do look at that as the baseline and they aim for that, in the future, if folks are currently not happy with how things have been going, and if we consider these 8 developments kind of representative of how things are going across the city, the baseline and the code we're, as a committee, pushing forward, the number, even when you round up, is 29, which is less than what is currently happening. And so I just don't know if we're fulfilling our objective as a committee in terms of preserving more trees. And I just did the number. I do understand part of that is, if you look, I can understand the counterpoint of 5 out of 8 developments currently meet that code and the other 3 don't. But even when you look at the amount of trees that are saved for those other 3 developments, it's 8 trees total. And so I just don't know if that's actually furthering and preserving more trees. And I would still support 25%, but even with that, the total minimum when you round up is 37, as you can see, which is 4 more trees than what currently is already happening. So I just wanted to at least point that out to make sure we're on track to actually come up with a code that preserves more trees, even if it's a slight number.
Quick point.
Yeah.
That isn't all that we're tasked with.
But it is one of our core mandates, one of the 5.
Well, I actually, can we double check on that? Because from my recollection, it's to establish clear and objective standards, not explicitly to preserve more trees.
It's all of them, I think.
Yeah, so the scope again is with any code update I do, we have to do clear and objective standards. And then with this one, we're balancing housing with the preservation of trees.
Right.
And then number 3 is consider preservation standards for larger trees similar to the Southeast Area Plan. Then we had our check-in with council and they still agree that, and Megan's on if we need to ask her any clarifying questions, but my understanding is the goal is to preserve the larger trees, incentivize that. And then if we can't incentivize them to preserve the larger trees, then let's look at a overall DBH. So we're still getting preservation of trees, which can include the larger trees. And then we talk about the mitigation. So any code update, we do clear and objective standards, and then the direction of council is to look at the larger trees than overall DBH.
And Pauline, can I make one other point just with that chart, that over half of those trees were from two projects, which I know specifically Caraway, that project is, over half of that is because there's a city park in it. So I don't know that it's, when you look at the acreage, right, there's Parkside and Caraway, those two, that's got to be 80% of the actual acreage. And those two projects are both first phase, which usually it's easier to save trees in those first phase. So I think if you were to eliminate those two projects and then look at it, that might be a little bit more of a true comparison of what you would get. I also want to add, I've had a couple conversations with engineers this week, looking at kind of impacts and costs. And what I kind of updated them with where we're at in terms of, with this packet. And without a doubt, we've had significant costs to development in terms of being able to grade. And so it'll be important as we go into the fee and lieu conversation. But I just want to bring that up. So before we start increasing percentages even more.
I've been thinking, about this because we're like, okay, well, if it's already green, are we trying to encourage that to happen? Or are we trying to prevent the ones that aren't green more than we're trying to discount the ones that manage to make it work, considering the, site complexities and variations that we have. This is it's a pretty good sample, but it is just a sample. I don't know if it's statistically relevant for the quantity of trees within the UGB that are up for the future, implementation of this. And that's the part that I'm conflicted on, which is I completely hear that, well, we already had a bunch of projects that met it. That seems like the floor might be too low. On the other hand, it's the ones that haven't met even our potential proposed, not even yet proposed, the floor that we've discussed so far, are more likely to be the ones that end up getting phone calls that create the opportunity for us to have this group in the first place. So I'm not really trying to lean one way or the other on it as much as point that out, is that we're not getting tree preservation on any sites that's actually required right now. So by requiring something, we should get more than we were getting before. Chris.
And also add one thing, because I think a lot of the impetus for creating this committee is because of the public outreach and comments on large trees coming down throughout the city, not just in developments. And so I know I've said this before, but I'll just say it again. I think the city still needs a citywide thing that addresses tree preservation in general. I think this is a start doing the development, but it's not, I don't believe that the city of Bend, the citizens are just upset about development. I think it's also individual trees.
Right, which I think is like the first,
scope, I understand,
yeah,
but I
like the
just
two
wanna say-
biggest buckets of our side recommendations are going to be urban forestry function and engineering standards review to try to improve the actual practical implementation of whatever the tree preservation code is. So with our scope, while in our seventh meeting here, it doesn't seem like it's that narrow, is narrow enough that that's absolutely really the two big things that we have one of the two big things that we have to recommend.
And see if we can keep moving to mitigation.
Yeah.
We could spend on this for 2 hours.
It's true. Covey, I did see you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one final thought. So I think it's fine for us to move. If that's what we're doing, we can move forward in mitigation. I guess at least my response to some of the points that have been raised would be, because we provided so much flexibility and we're going to be with all these kind of 4 options, especially taking that into consideration, I feel like having a floor that's already met by majority of the developments we've looked at, especially if we're not considering all of them model developments or their aberrations in some way. I do feel if that floor is really low, then I feel like because they go hand in hand, for me personally, when I'm deciding the mitigation and fee and lieu options, they would be much stricter. But if the floor was higher, then I think it could make the mitigation and fee and lieu options a little bit more lenient. And so I feel like they do go hand in hand from my perspective. Yeah, there is that.
Yeah.
So, and I think I I just want to mention at least that and share that with the group as we go into that, if we're going to keep the air. Otherwise, if we're increasing the floor, then I think that would be more. And I think to developers' point, there are going to be options. So I understand 5 out of 8 developments are currently meeting it, 3 out of 8 are not. But even for those 3 out of 8, they could, if it's too costly to change any of their design, they still have the option of mitigation and fee in lieu that they will still have.
Right.
So I feel like there's a lot of room. And to me, it still feels like even like 25%, you can see that 4 out of 8 meet it, and the Viridian would only have to plant 1 more tree or half a tree. So I feel like I feel like 25% still feels like a better base to me, because then it makes puts less onus on the mitigation and fee in lieu options.
Okay, fully heard. Just 1 second, Sue. The other thing that we're trying to balance, though, is we want to make sure that the incentives prioritize the preservation as the first step. And so the closer we make those, it might end up that the unintended consequence is more tree replacement and fee and less preservation, because they're stacked too close together. And there'll be major pushback if we just say, okay, well, then just make it $1 million per tree or something like that for fee and lieu. So totally heard. Absolutely. Sue.
Is the discussion about incentivizing the larger trees in terms of either double counting or giving them a bump in percentage, is that part of the mitigation discussion?
No.
Okay, can we make sure we have that at some point in time?
So I guess I'm still not understanding double counting or a bump. Like,
So
I haven't seen that in other codes. So I need help understanding what that means.
I have no idea. If
I think what I heard it
exists
was, is if it's a 20-inch tree and you're able to preserve it, then it counts as 40 inches toward the overall DBH.
Correct.
Or some
anywhere.
percent.
Or some percent,
As
Yeah.
an incentive to.
as an
preserve the
incentive
larger
to save
trees
that tree.
When we're looking at
Yeah.
DBH.
Because I really believe the public, when they see, and I know a big ponderosa might be closer to the end of its life, but the visual impact of a big tree being taken down is much more significant than a couple small trees.
Or clear cutting, western juniper,
Yeah,
bunch of small scrubby
Yeah.
trees. Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I think it's also wrong, but
but
that's just me.
I think with what we've been charged with is saving more large
Putting it
trees.
in
And I think a
incentive,
way
say.
to do that
Yeah.
is to incentivize it.
And especially like on a new development site, it's less likely that they were irrigated to grow that fast versus the one that's in somebody's front yard that has
Correct.
been irrigated for 20 years. So it's a good question. Maybe we should ask an arborist.
So
Who's
there's a
answers that?
term, and it's not just in culture, but it's in a lot of environmental issues, called greenwashing, which is basically doing things that aesthetically look, or maybe aesthetics is wrong, but it looks appealing, but it actually, so let's say, for example, we remove all the trees, we save the one big one. It looks good because we saved this big tree, but then we're causing a huge amount of damage. And I think a lot of this mitigation, Kai makes a great point. There's a lot of different ways we can look at this, but if we lower the floor one way, I guess what I'm trying to say is, in layman's term, more trees good, less trees bad. I think it comes down to accounting. Like Corey was saying, it's going to cost more, unfortunately, to do all these things for tree preservation. But the fact of the matter is, we haven't accounted for the benefits of trees in the past. We've just removed them, and we haven't put that in the ledger. What I think the city's trying to do, and what most municipalities are trying to do with their urban forest management, is to put trees back on the ledger. Say, these are the benefits that the trees provide. And then removing the trees, it takes away some valuation to the land, to the city, to the people, et cetera. And so I think that's what needs to get captured. If we remove more trees, it's got to be paid for some way, whether that's through mitigation, money, et cetera. So we're just trying to get trees on the ledger is the way I look at it, and trying to account for those benefits.
So it's coming back to that idea of flexibility and balance we've been talking about the whole time.
100%. And I think because I've been on both sides of the coin, I've worked with developers as well. And, having flexibility, because sometimes you hit these wooded lots, like Corey's saying, if you have a design where you can take advantage of a lot of trees, that's great. But if you have and we'll talk about the single lots, but if you have a single family home and there's one tree in the middle, that's really tough for you to develop on that. And so I think it's having flexibility so that you can allow for, because we want tree preservation, but number one rule in horticulture, you got to put the right tree in right plant in the right place. And sometimes a plant is just too close to the foundation or too close to infrastructure. So again, with the flexibility, I think is great. And the lower percentage might accommodate for that, but I think we also need to put a realistic value on trees and what they provide for the city when they get removed.
The other thing I'd add is simplicity, which we're trying to strive towards. And too many different formulas and percentages and if this, that, and that, this, then it just becomes so confusing. It's hard to implement.
Can I just say one last thing?
Yeah, you bet.
Just, I think the public outcry over some of that prompted the formation of this committee is when, like, everyone know about Murphy Road where the RV park's going in. Okay, when you see something clear cut, like that's what I'm talking about on the visual impact. So I think we have to keep in mind during our discussions that the public drove the formation of this committee, and certainly a single family lot with a tree in the center, nobody's going to call about that, right? People are
They
going to
do.
call and raise their voice when they see things like Murphy Road. And we talked about what happened at the corner of Shovelin Park and where you see a bunch of trees going. And that, I think, is what we're really trying to prevent.
And usually it's the same people that complain about affordable housing.
I-
Save the trees, I want affordable housing. Save the trees, I want affordable housing. So we just have to balance that.
So just so we keep moving, the other, and this, it's good discussion because this next table that I'm presenting is looking at the overall DBH, similar to the one prior to with the 20-inch trees. When you round up or down, the percent of overall trees preserved out of these projects is only 23%, which is greater than the 20%, but we went with 25. So the overall is actually preserving less DBH than the 25% that we're recommending. If we wanted to look at what Sue is suggesting with the double counting of larger trees and more of incentive to preserve the larger trees and more of incentive to do the 20% of the larger trees, one recommendation would be to bump that 25% up to 30 if we're going to double count and incentivize the larger trees. Because I was looking at like a 21-inch tree, then maybe you count it as a 42-inch. And I think that formula is not that complicated, and you would get to preserving, as council's goal, first the priority trees, then the overall DBH. So something for the committee to think about is that keep the 20% because we want to incentivize that lower percent and preservation of the larger trees, but maybe bump the 25 to the 30. With the caveat that you get to count those larger trees overall DBH twice. So we'll get back to that, but just keep it in mind. And then I need help. I reached out to Dan a little bit on this and worked with Renee and just trying to, so my thought process is like, oh, this is simple. We'll just preserve a certain amount of trees. And if we can't, then we'll just replace it at 1-to-1 or 2-to-1, or we'll preserve, larger trees as 3-to-1, use that ratio. Well, the more I started looking into it, and if you saw my email yesterday, and unless I'm not thinking about this right, because I'm obviously not a tree expert, I don't see how you can preserve if DBH to caliper. So for example, if we took Viridian and they are preserving 98 DBH, or they have to mitigate for 98 DBH. That is a number of trees to get them to 144 that they actually have to preserve, but we don't know what trees they are going to cut down. Is it a 6-inch? Is it a 10-inch? Is it a 20-inch? That only works in my mind, unless I'm not thinking about this correctly. If you and I'm not suggesting this, if you preserve if you require 100% preservation on site and they only preserve 30%, that 70% that's coming down because you see them on a map and the size of their DBH, and you can convert that to tree replacement.
Another way that we kind of got to this is we had to back into it because we were starting to talk about fee in lieu of preservation and charging on a per tree basis. If a developer gets to the point where they can't preserve the 20% 20-inch priority trees and they're going for DBH, maybe they can preserve the total DBH required, but they fall short. So this is where this chart is that Colleen created of where these different sample projects fall short or exceed the actual DBH preserved. If we recommend 25% preservation, then there's a delta there of number of inches that they're missing, to meet the preservation. We need to convert that to trees. So there's 100 inches, diameter inches of tree that is lost that needs to be mitigated for. How do we convert that to, if they're going to do on-site replacement, great. Or if they want to pay a fee, we need to try to convert that to number of trees. So that's what this slide is suggesting for discussion. If we treated 10 inches of DBH lost as one tree that needs to be planted on site.
And this is pulled from a couple other cities that I saw that regulate based on DBH versus on number of trees being cut down. So again, with Meridian, their 25% requirement is 242 inches of DBH. They're only preserving 144. They need to mitigate for 98 DBH. And so if we went with a one tree replaced per 10 inches DBH removed, then it would be 9.8. Whether or not we round up or down is a question for if there's even support for this concept. Unless there's other options that this committee can help me understand. The only other thing to go back to is instead of preserving 25% of DBH, it would be preserving 25% of the trees on site. Then you're down to the number of trees being removed.
Right.
And then you would use like the 1-to-1 or 1-to-2. That does not incentivize preserving the larger trees though. Preserving overall DBH does.
We've continually come back to DBH as the least confusing. Doesn't mean it's simple, but the least confusing of them. Chris, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I'm still not 100% clear, I guess, why you need to base it off the sum of DBH versus just looking at the table of trees and doing it line item by line item.
So when I was looking at Meridian, they are going to preserve the 144 DBH, and we know which trees those are. They're going to remove all the other trees. So if we went to how do you take the 6-inch trees that get cut and add that up to their missing 98 DBH? Or do you take the 20-inch trees first, but it never evenly adds up to the 98 that's missing?
Well, I guess why I'm still confused, I guess, instead of like a tree count, I'm like, okay, you remove 10 trees, replace it by, if it's a 10-inch or lower, it's 1-to-1. If it's a 20-inch or bigger, a 1-to-2 or something like that, and just do a count. And then based on the diameter, change the count number.
But we don't know which ones are counting towards their missing 98.
No,
Yeah,
I think
I finally get it.
yeah,
It's
I
how
think
that
he's
90
forgetting
yeah.
DBH, just looking at the trees itself, the number and the specific trees, the inventory of trees.
Yeah, I mean, ideally they should be, and again, I think this goes, I think arborists need to be more involved in the design process. Because that's really the big time you're going to do any preservation. I was just on site today where there's a project that, they put a sidewalk, they jogged the sidewalk to try to get around this tree, but then they put a dry well 5 feet away from the base of this tree. And so, it's a 40-inch tree, the tree's already in poor health, 5 feet away, you got to excavate down 10 feet or so, it's not going to survive and do well. So there's little I can do in that point. If they've accepted that dry well, say everything's good, except for just condemn the tree. And so I think having an arborist involved in the design phase, and I'm not sure if this is currently a part, but all trees should be inventoried. All trees should have some kind of health and structure, a viability study, essentially determine what trees are going to be viable trees. Because to your point too, not every 6, because basically the way we have it right now, it's kind of like if I was to hit a car, an insurance company just weighed my car and said, okay, this is how much the car weighs. We're going to replace it by, whatever X amount per pound. But not all cars are the same. They're not valued the same. A 6-inch tree could be an open grown tree and good structure. It could be underneath a ponderosa pine and not be worth retaining. So there's a lot of variabilities, but without a complete inventory and assessment of the trees, it's going to be hard to make any good decision on that. on which trees are better to keep versus not better to keep.
Which I think is on the sort of next layer of suggestions that we need. I don't know that we're equipped to make a recommendation that includes another axis for health.
Well, it's kind of already in the tree code right now, because if you look at the Bend tree code, there's a line item in there. It says the ANSI standards are kind of what we should be using for tree, basically the management of trees. And if you look at the ANSI standards, first thing you should do in a development phase or the planning phase is to try to get a tree inventory. And so it's in there in our tree code already.
We will be requiring a tree inventory, at least location, tree identifier, and size. I think where we haven't yet agreed is there more subjective stuff beyond that. So what Pauline's trying to pull up is an example of one of those tree inventories, because I want to try to make sure we're not missing something, because it seemed like a few of you got how you could explain how you would mitigate if we're calculating a certain percentage of DVH that must be retained on site and a developer falls short of that. Say it's a 6, an 18, and a 20-inch tree that are removed, and they need to make up for that. We can't make them plant a 6, an 8, and a 20-inch tree. So.
Can you start the count with the largest trees? With that 98? So you start counting with the largest numbers and then go prioritize those and go down until you hit the 98. So there's
Got it.
26, a 24, a
Yep.
20, two 20s. You count those first before you go down. So you start counting those first, and then that prioritize, and then you have
Like a 3-to-1 replacement.
perhaps, higher replacement on those. And then that prioritizes saving those trees because you get better mitigation.
I did do that, because that's, Portland provided, because I reached out to them too, because we've been basing a lot of our discussion on what they've
Yeah.
done. That's how we got to DVH. And so this is ready and up on the screen. I don't know if you can see all these numbers. This is what they're retaining. These are all the trees that they're removing. Let me keep going so you can see. So I tried to get to the 98, and it's a bit of a game. So in my mind, it's not 100% clear and objective, because I think I grabbed was there a 30? There's some 26, there's a 42. And then you do, let's say, to 32. So then help me with my math, we're at 72. Then I was trying to find, well, I guess the next big one would be 26. Anyways, at some point, then it put me over the 98. So then I had to go backtrack and try and find like the right number to get me to 98.
Well,
and we're not going to get that. all
But
the
you
time.
start with the highest ones and you
Mhm.
go
And then maybe mitigate on.
until you get over 98, and you could go over 90. I mean, you don't have to hit it exactly. I mean, but
Did you
if you
round
go-
up to like the nearest 10? Or
I'm
something?
not even sure it's rounding up. I think you start with the highest numbers and go down till you reach a number that's over 98.
Or
At or over,
Two as
yeah.
opposed to
And those are your
as you
mitigation
can.
trees.
so we could do like 42. Now here,
I-
42.
I don't know how that turns out. I mean, it's a
Yeah,
theory.
I
we'd have to-
understand the
we'd have to
concept now.
look
Yeah,
at.
okay.
It may be completely wacky when you try to implement it, but it seems like it prioritizes larger trees through the mitigation process
Yeah.
also. But the 1 tree per 10 inches is pretty common throughout most codes. I mean, that's pretty standard. And that
So-
works too.
Let's say we did your example, we did a 42, a 28, and 28, and if we did the 3-to-1, we were at 9 trees. So it's the same.
It's
So that's what I was finding yesterday. I was kind of
Say we
like,
want to present it.
Okay.
Or, so then it goes 4-to-1. So you incentivize it somehow, but then disincentivizing the mitigation benefit you, or do you really want to incentivize the process up
I
front?
think the upfront process is where you want to incentivize, right? Saving it.
Yeah, did you want to do it at both spots? Yeah, because if you do it during mitigation, it may help people try to save more initially if they run through the process.
so I'm gonna go to my hidden slide. So this is what Portland did. Let me see if I can do current slide. Okay, so I hid it, so let me make sure it still looks all right. In cases where the 25% DBH is not preserved, the mitigation replacement required to meet the standard is based on the largest trees or trees proposed for removal that equal the required DBH. And I can reword that, but I think it's getting to where you're at.
Right.
And so, yes, there is a way to do it, and that is what Portland does.
Right,
And then that wouldn't the larger trees.
right. It'd be worth running through a couple projects and see what difference it makes.
I do, yeah, sorry. I'm deep in thinking. Let's start with Kathy.
I just wanted to second what Chris is mentioning. I've designed scores of subdivisions and every single one had exactly the kind of arborist report that you're mentioning, but it included the health and structure. And I just want to say there are a lot of places where trees are just not worth saving, and we really shouldn't be mitigating for those. They need to, so including the health is only to the benefit of the developer, because you're not mitigating for something that really shouldn't be mitigated for. And then just as an aside, every community I've worked in has replacement requirements, and oftentimes, depending on the site or where you're going to be putting trees, we've often increased the size of the tree, say from a 15-gallon to a 24-box to count for multiple trees, which I guess in your calculation would be bigger DBH if it made sense to do so. Anyway, I just wanted to say, yes, we should, as our sidebar, make this recommendation, but include the health of the tree because it's an important aspect as to whether it should be mitigated for or not.
Well, we had talked about, and I need to look at it, we're making clear and objective standards, but we can add a discretionary path that if a developer doesn't want to use clear and objective, they can go through this path and submit, because it's added cost, minors, obviously, if you have to go through every tree and talk about the health. If they want to go through that to eliminate a number of trees to preserve, then we can add that
I
discretionary
think that's
path.
great. I mean, I think that, giving options and it'll make sense to you or it won't financially to do that. So.
And in the Bend Development Code, with a lot of the updates I've been doing, we do have a clear and objective path for a lot of standards, and we have the discretionary path.
Okay, so as long as there is a clear and objective path,
Because that's quick and easy.
then you have an option. It's okay to have a discretionary path.
Right.
Okay, that makes me more comfortable just because the complexity and the variations between the sites is the part where we're trying to capture as many of those variations with the options that we provide that are clear and objective. But if there's going to be something, the minute council makes a plan and staff implements it, it's going to be the first application is going to be weird after that,
Right.
and then have to try to figure it out.
There's another.
Oh, sorry, Kathy, yes.
Yeah, if I may, and I think this conversation about DBH felt a little complicated, and I feel like, at least the way I understood Chris's point, it felt like a much simpler option to do that, which was basing it on the trees that are actually cut based on their size. And it's, to me, I think it was removing the DBH minimum calculation. I don't know if I understood that correctly.
Well, I think I'm still not 100% sure if I understand it, but I think from my understanding of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, essentially you're looking at their, a developer comes, they say, okay, we're saving this percentage of the diameter trees, we're saving this amount of diameters. This accumulation of diameter of trees we're saving, but you don't know which ones are being saved.
You know which ones are being saved, but of the 25%, let's say they're saving 20%. So they need to mitigate for the extra 5%. Which 5% are we counting?
Okay.
And so what Dan is saying, you would start with the largest ones and not go by DBH, just go by the largest ones to add up to the 98.
Yeah, okay, on board with it. That makes sense.
Okay, well, I still had a question, actually. How is that all about me?
That's the second, okay.
And I think this is something I've been struggling with. I had to talk with Christy about this, and I'm still not completely understanding the flow chart that you have there. Because in my mind, I know the flow chart goes like this, but it's still, until I see otherwise, I feel like it's still 4 options that are available at any point. And they could preserve the priority trees. If they don't, you can preserve the DBH. If not, you can mitigate. If not, you can do fee and lieu. So it's kind of like 4 options. And then each of those options might have further mitigation, might have 1 or 2 options below it, but it's not necessarily, I don't see a flow to it until we establish for some reason that you have to go through this path, right?
Right, and
There
I
could be
think there will always
attractive-
be 4 options.
Okay.
We're just trying to figure out how do you get someone to
So-
be very interested in preserving the
Yes.
20.
I guess, and the reason I want to clarify that first before my question is that, to me, mitigation doesn't necessarily rely on which option they're going on. They only get to that point if they don't want to do the other 2 options of priority trees for DBH. So mitigation could be simpler and just based on how many trees are cut down above a percentage or whatever we decide. That could be based on just kind of, I think, what Chris originally mentioned, which is based on the size of trees that are cut down and replacing those trees. So that way we don't have to do this complex DBH calculation of how much inches they have to plant. It's just based on the trees cut down above a certain percentage. Does that make sense?
But then I think you get to 100% instead of 25.
Well, we can decide what percentage that is.
I think,
Well, we're at 25 right now.
I think we are deciding the percentage by choosing 20% and 25%.
Right.
Because it's the difference that you can't reach.
Whereas in your example, Kavi, it'd be great. I mean, it's so easy if you, like some say you just, and I'm not recommending this, this is not.
Yeah, but what if you did?
But if you did 100%
Yeah.
and they cut down 25%, you know exactly which 25 and the sizes of those trees and you
Mhm.
mitigate.
But if
because
you-
we're not there.
But as an option, just as an idea, I haven't thought this through, but if you did do say 100, but you still made it ratio of like, if you're cutting 10 trees below 10 inches, you plant 1 tree. If you're cutting down a tree above 20 inches, you plant 3 trees. We could still come up with those ratios and make it work and still make it reasonable.
And what's the incentive to preserve any?
Because the
That's where
big
I go
trees,
back to bump it.
well, the big trees, you're still planting a lot more. And then for every tree you're cutting, you're still replacing.
Yeah.
They
So
still
when
have that
we-
option at any time.
When we were talking about replacement, this is the ratios we were talking about. And we can still get there with what Dan's suggesting. And if we're incentivizing and starting at, counting at the larger trees first, then you would look at the on-site replacement option number 2. So larger trees larger than 14 inches would be a 1 to 3. So for every one you cut down, you replace with 3, and then 1 to 2, and then 1 to 1 for the smaller trees.
I have a quick question. Well, on that ratio, are you saying a specific size tree that you?
So what we put, well, it'd be the bottom part. So a deciduous tree would be a 2-inch caliper measured at 4 1/2 feet above the ground. Then a coniferous would be 6 feet height.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you.
So not basing bigger box trees, and they would just be this. So if there is support, and we can go around the table for what Dan recommended, it would be that recommendation with number 2 for the tree replacement ratio.
Could Dan restate what is? So I know what I'm voting on. I wasn't totally clear. So that's another-
Well, yeah, Pauline may have said it better, but I guess if we go back to the example where we needed 98,
The Viridian.
yeah, the Viridian where we need to mitigate for the 98 dBH, we have to get to that number. And so we would get to that number by counting the larger trees first. So if there's a 30 and a 30 and a 20, that's 80 there. And then maybe there's another 20. So we get to 100 and we go over, but you have to exceed it. You don't have to match it, but it has to exceed. And then those are the trees you mitigate on. And then if you go back to the chart, you would then understand the numbers.
I gotcha.
They're all over that certain size, so they would be mitigated on a 1 to 3 ratio. So you'd mitigate more.
I understand. Okay.
It is an extra level, adds one more step of complexity.
times the 6 trees that equal 98 inches.
Right. And as Jeff said, it may not make any difference if we, I guess we'd probably be good.
Oh, just because the math in this one, it happens to work at it's 9 or 10 trees. in
Yeah,
either-
so
in
it-
either
yeah.
case, but
But if it's smaller ones, let's say they're 6 inches, you're gonna need a lot more 6-inch trees to add up to 98. Let's say there isn't larger ones, so then you're going to have a 1-to-1 replacement of the smaller trees, and that will add up too.
That makes sense.
Christie?
Just like from a complexity standpoint, like if we brought up that tree inventory, it's in an Excel spreadsheet. You just sort by size, the biggest ones come up to the top.
Yeah,
And then you have your chart right there, and it's like, okay, this is over this number.
pretty
This
simple
is,
Excel stuff.
it is, it's not as complicated as describing it with words when you're actually doing it, I
Yeah.
think,
My thing
so.
with Excel though is if you can describe it in words, you can always write a formula.
Right,
So like,
And
if
if you
we can
use
get to that, and
Yeah.
if,
Yeah.
there might be a bunch of
Right.
if else embedded statements, but it all does get there.
Yeah.
Mentioned it, planners have Excel worksheets, so remember, this is going to be
I think they all have
Apply.
Excel work.
during design review, so we need to be sure that everybody can read the words of the code and then apply it and understand it without a lot of interpretation.
Is staff allowed to supply, is staff allowed to supply a template
Well,
for applicants to use?
there's going to be submittal requirements because we're now going to have a real tree preservation code. And in that submittal requirements, it's going to be the inventory that Renee was talking about and the DBH. And then if they're going to propose mitigation, they're going to include in a table, and we'll word the submittal requirement very clear of what they're submitting to show the number and sizes of trees that they're removing to the ratio of replanting trees. And then they'll submit a site plan showing where those trees will be replanted on site.
And the tree inventory essentially already holds that information,
Yes,
right? So it's not additional work, so.
No, it's just breaking it out, saying we're preserving 20%, the 5% that we're not preserving, here's the size of the trees, starting from the largest. And this is the ratio that we're going to be replacing.
And there probably could even be a formula written into an Excel sheet that's handed to a developer that would pop those numbers out for them, just saying.
I'll call you. and get that.
I have a question before I go to Chris.
I think Morgan is.
Oh, I don't look to my right. You
You
need to sit somewhere else. As I'm thinking about the replacement, whatever the ratio ends up being, like we're already gonna have street trees. I live in the residential world, so I'm imagining like residential, low, medium, and up density, but is there a point at which you end up with more trees you have to plant? Because the street trees are designed for their optimal distance, and that's another requirement. If we require enough trees that they start to have to be planted in backyards, then that means backyard landscaping, that's a $5,000 to $8,000 increase in price per home, which is another thing. Like, I don't know if that's worth talking about. I don't know if at what point we say, well, we don't have enough trees to,
Then
we
they
don't have enough
pay
place to plant, then they just pay. Okay, thank you.
based on the number of trees that they aren't going to plant. So they can plant, let's say they're required to plant 10 trees and they're only gonna plant 2.
There's
then
room
they
for
pay
6.
for 8.
Okay,
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, Chris, you,
Oh,
I'm sorry. Would, let the record reflect that Jeff hates Morgan.
Well, I was a disembodied voice at the last meeting, so now that I'm here in person, I appreciate it. I take
Hi, I'm
getting
Jeff.
used to. So, okay, because I was a disembodied voice last time, I didn't get to experience in the room what the response was when I threw some bombs. So let me do this again. Dan, I mean, I think like if we do as Christy is suggesting in a very common sense way and just sort by size, there's no distinguishing between the trees that are removed because of at the developer's discretion or the trees that are removed due to requirements of city standards. So I just want to reiterate that because city standards eliminated a lot of trees right out of the gate, it feels like a penalty to developers to have to either mitigate or pay, Pauline, as you so clearly stated, trees that wouldn't necessarily, that developers don't have any ability to essentially translate around. So if we are going to do this, I just, again, really want to encourage us to consider adjusting that denominator so that it is trees that the developer does have the discretion to remove or retain, and then put the onus on the developer to either develop around those or move on to mitigation or pay the fee in lieu. Because those are the only ones that we have any control over.
And if that's the route that this committee as a whole is interested in doing, then I would recommend we go through those tables again. And I would take out all those trees to see what 20% looks like, because it'll be a lot lower number.
Nope. If I can quickly answer on that, I think it also gives developers an incentive to do more work in the planning and design phase and try to have tree preservation then, because again, quite often I get called on the site where it's like, okay, we're putting our road right here next to this tree. Can we save it? No, you can't do that. So I can only make those changes in design phase. And so I think hopefully that's an incentive for developers, architects, whoever, to make more tree preservation decisions early up. And then I think will all pan out.
And could I just clarify?
Yeah.
You're saying if the right of way or this, whatever, we need a word for this type of tree. You know, it's the engineering department's tree, we'll call it, that has to be removed. By taking that out of the denominator, that would be an incentive for the developer to upfront. It's another opportunity to plan upfront for the developer because they know that the trees that are outside of that need to be preserved is what's up for discussion.
Well, they know that large trees are a priority for the city and the people of the city. And so if they develop too close to it, then they're gonna have to remove that. Then they're gonna have to basically add to that ledger. They're gonna have to pay the city back, pay the people back for the removal of that large tree. Or I can plan around it and put a street further away, or I don't have to make houses so big. I can make smaller homes. There's a bunch of things you can do in design phase to try to preserve that tree. You can work with an arborist to find alternative designs, maybe work with the city. I think Karen's been very vocal about this, about alternative designs that are more tree friendly. So there are a lot of things we can do early on, but once the design is in place, then yeah, that's when we make when myself as an arborist, I go and say, yeah, this home is too close to the tree, it needs to come out. Then it becomes one of those trees where it's an engineer tree, it has to be removed. And another thing too is we see, I don't think it's necessarily greenwashing, but a lot of times developers will retain a lot of these trees because it looks good, but then, Northwest Crossing is a big example of this. Down the road, they're just too close to these, ponderosa pine grow very large. And they retain these ponderosa pines very close to foundation, very close to infrastructure. And then at some point down the road, someone wants to remove that tree because it's too close to the home. And they have a good viable argument for that. However, the developers move down, they're onto the next project. But as arborists, we go in, we see the trees day after day. So anyways, I'm getting sidetracked. Okay. Trying to remember. Oh, my one comment I was going to say was whatever this looks like in code. One of the things I really like that Seattle did is they developed kind of like what you had a visual flow chart to, because it all comes down to communication. I think reading a block of text can be very intimidating, and making just like a quick one pager of that flow chart and trying to visualize it, simplify the language, even if it has to be in codese, to make a more visual way, a more visual display of that information so that developers can work through it a little bit easier.
We do that for a lot of projects. We
Yeah,
call
okay.
it quick reference guide,
Yeah.
so we can.
Everyone's got their hand up. You guys go first.
Okay, so I know Sarah hasn't had a chance to talk at all today yet, so
Thank you. If we consider not counting trees in a future or existing right away that needs to be improved, I'm wondering if, well, first I should say there are circumstances where like an intersection has to align and there's not a lot of flexibility over the road, where the road goes. At that point, there's potentially it can move even arterials and collectors. I think the TSP or the code says that they're not shown in their exact location. There's flexibility. So in some situations, especially in master planned areas where you've got 20 acres or more, you have a lot more control over where that goes, and you can potentially pick a route to avoid trees. So I'm wondering if maybe there's a different standard for master planned
Mhm.
areas over X number of acres. Because they have a lot more control over what they do. And one of those not being to reduce the required number of trees. One of those standards. I know master plan, you can pick your own code and just think it needs to either you can't count the right of way trees, or if we do, that they're held to a higher percentage, or whatever we do for tree replacement, just to encourage a better design.
Sue?
So I just wanted to make sure I was understanding, Morgan, it's not every street that the engineers are, it's streets that are on the master transportation plan, correct?
So I'm not actually, because of the points that Sarah just made, I'm not as concerned about right-of-way trees, I think, as the group has been generally.
Mhm.
Don't take off the recommendation to reduce right-of-way.
Oh, I
standards.
just. Yeah.
But even on smaller sites, an acre or even less, the city doesn't often allow for a lot of flexibility in terms of water and sewer lines.
Right.
So it's really utilities largely that I'm thinking about, particularly because we're not going to have as many large development sites in Bend as we will smaller infill projects. So that comes to mind as a more pressing concern.
I mean, it seems to me if the city's dictating a tree be removed, then the developer shouldn't have to be mitigating for a tree that the city is requiring to be removed. But I think it provides more incentive for something we discussed early on, which is bringing an arborist on staff at the city. And then that person can be talking to the engineering department early on, and it takes some of the weight off the developer. So there's an advocate for the tree in the city during, early
Yep.
design reviews.
So if we went with the right of way, just when you say the city is requiring it, the only time we would
Well, if engineering's saying,
well, like if it's an arterial collector, it's on our
Correct.
transportation system
Or,
plan, we know that road's
intersection
going in.
alignment.
Right,
or-
But there's
right.
more flexibility, I think, when they design from the very beginning with maybe local streets, but they know they have to put in the arterials and collectors.
correct. Those are the ones where I don't think that the developer should be responsible. And I do agree with Sarah that I think master plans, they're just by nature, right? Much bigger, and that perhaps a different standard.
It's also just real quick, and I agree with the arborist thing for the city, by the way, but it's anything
Oh, really?
underground. It's utilities, stormwater management, anything that's changing grade
Yeah.
below ground, that's going to affect trees as well. So I think you can throw that in that bucket in terms of what the city is requiring.
One thing people sometimes don't think about, like when you're looking at a map and you see all these trees and you're looking at road alignments and you're like, oh, there's a great tree, we could just shift the road like 10 feet. Well, there could be like a massive rock outcropping there, or a variable of things. One of the massive things that drive costs is the grading process that we go through.
Mhm.
And what can really drive costs is if you're doing a phase and you're taking all the dirt and you're taking it off the site and then you're bringing it back on. And so, not saying it's it's possible, but we just have to kind of consider all the variables.
Kathy and then Dan.
Andrew's right, yay. Yeah, I just wanted to second that this is an issue. And one of the things that didn't get mentioned is the fire department and fire access. And for smaller parcels, I often deal with that as an issue. And so it's not just a grading, and it's just not the utilities, but it's fire access and turnarounds in small spaces. And I would agree that it seems unfair to require mitigation under those circumstances, but I also agree with Sarah's remarks regarding larger master plans, but acknowledging what Corey is saying, it's not always a simple thing. So this is why it's great to have the option for if you don't do the one path, you have an alternative path, because nothing fits all. So keeping that flexibility, but also just mentioning fire access is often a big issue. I think.
And I wasn't disagreeing with the concept of bringing, arborists in and doing a little bit more planning ahead of time and really thinking through it. I just think it's important that we all understand there's a lot of variables. It's not just tree and road, right? There's the utilities, there's grading, grade point, fire turnarounds. And so it's complicated, which is why it's not easy to figure out the cost either.
Dan.
Yeah, in terms of exemptions, take that back to simplicity. Sometimes the more exemptions you have, the more complex it gets and the more sort of, it's hard to get clarity on, and there's a lot of discussion and disagreement over those exemptions. So I think City of Salem, City of Eugene has some good exemptions on their tree code, and they come back to what the group's been talking about. It's arterials, collectors, and the TSP and utility easements are basically the things that are exempt. And then other items are really, there's a lot of flexibility with everything else.
All right, thank you. So are we at a point where we're leaning toward the idea of if you're splitting between total DBH and on-site replacement trees, that replacement tree calculation starts with, okay, of the trees that got removed, go big to small till you get the DBH that you needed, and that's your tree count for replacement? So I'm getting some head nods.
Just say that again.
Spreadsheet.
I'm gonna restate Dan's restatement and Pauline's restatement of Dan's concept and include what Chris said and took into account what Covey was bringing up. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I just had a question about this. It felt like we were talking about the arterials and collectors and utilities and excluding that. And I get some of the points of it being more precise in terms of what's in the control of developers, but I think Pauline has mentioned this, it would require relooking at all the numbers, because based again on the numbers we have, I think the percentages we have are already lenient enough that to take that into consideration. So if it's more precise, percentages would go up. And I think I feel like, I don't know if we're trying to establish a decision on that, because I feel like we've been circling that with the last meeting too. And
I mean, it's
back to
possible. That's a good point. So it's possible that we need to ask Pauline to redo our stoplight chart with
I don't know if
those
there's consensus
excluded.
for
Yeah,
people
I'd like to get an idea of the group's thoughts on whether that's a useful exercise, because it gives us data to work with, but it's also another go back to reanalyzing.
And I will say, we've been talking about right-of-ways and utilities. There's other aspects of the development code that mandate clear vision areas and fire truck turnaround and vertical clearance for fire trucks to get. So we need to draw the line at some point of like how much of the development code do you get relief from, because that also, those different code sections come into play based on the different types of development you're doing. So.
And they're in the code today, the streets, the utilities, and the developer just writes a burden of proof. So we're putting streets in the utilities, so we don't need to preserve trees. So the more we, like Renee's saying, it doesn't count, you really get into very little area to count for trees. So the percentages, I would think, would have to go up.
Which we saw in Eugene, right, had a higher percentage, and you said Eugene.
And Salem.
Yeah.
Or do we just keep it simple, you look at the property as a whole and you keep the percentages low? So that way the design in the beginning is looking at the property as a whole versus this is how we're going to develop it. Now we get to take out all this stuff. Like, it doesn't incentivize too much creativity to save the larger trees. But if we want to go that route, I would highly recommend I re-look at those tables, because it will look very different.
And I wasn't suggesting we opened that Pandora's box, or like, because it seems like it's a lot more, like we're almost going back to meetings. And so I just wanted to establish that so we can move forward and not keep coming back to it again. I feel like it's probably helpful to decide one way or the other. And if, I don't know what the benefits are and the costs. There are costs to go back and do that all over again.
Okay. I know Sue had her hand up too, and also Chris again. Sue, are you?
I don't.
Yeah, I think Pauline and Renee made a good point in that middle ground, and I backtracked a little bit for what Morgan would mention too. On those smaller, it's harder on smaller lots to have flexibility in design. And I think it's easier on bigger lots to have flexibility in design. But I think the biggest thing that we should try to incentivize is, again, getting an arborist in there earlier so that at least the developer has tree preservation in mind versus the temperature that I get so far in a lot of the projects I've been involved in Bend is, okay, this is where we're building. You know, we're going to remove this. Can you write us a memo so that we can remove this tree because the road is too close versus, again, the design earlier. And then a question, and at the risk of overcomplicating things before we go on the mitigation route, my question is, is there any kind of long-term bonding or monitoring of trees either that are preserved or trees that are planted to make sure that the trees that are being disturbed from development, that they actually stay alive for 2 to 3 years, and trees that are planted, are they staying alive for 2 to 3 years? One of the great things I picked up at the conference I was at not too long ago, Wei Zhang, arborist down in California, is it's not just about tree planting, but it's about tree growing. There's a lot of tree planting projects out there, again, falling in that whitewashing or greenwashing scenario where it looks really good on the newsreel. They planted a whole bunch of trees, but when you go back later, upwards of 90% of those trees are dead. And so it will be a lot of wasted money and assets if we don't monitor and have some kind of incentive to make sure that the tree is not just planted, but maintained and stays alive during an establishment period, which is typically around 3 to 5 years.
Yep, and I've seen that in code, so I've added that into our draft. For the replacement trees, I will be working with our legal department on
Yeah,
the
that's
preservation of.
We're gonna need to talk about that,
Existing
because that's
trees.
a pretty big program. Like, right now, we bond for infrastructure, but that tends to be before development. And so to bond once development is done, that's like beyond the legal department. That's something that planning would have to be checking on. And then enforcing those bonds that's a big program that we don't currently have the staff to do. So that's something we would need to talk about if
Yeah, I was
that's in the
thinking.
code, because that's having somebody that's not a lawyer to go out and to be checking trees for X amount of time. We did this with our sidewalks, and I'll know because I inherited the litigation. And one of the big problems we got into with sidewalks is the inspection and then enforcing bonds didn't happen for decades. We had the structure in place, we just didn't have the staff and we didn't do it. So in the end, all of us community members, paid to do curb ramps, to upgrade side. We're all paying for it. So I get concerned about creating programs unless we are really intentional about seeing them through, having the staff, having a system to say, now we are doing it and we're paying for it, which if it's not added to the cost of permitting in the CDD department, i.e. developers, there's no funding.
And
So
the
we just
examples
have
I've
to
seen
think
are
about it.
for the ones that Chris was talking about, the tree replacement requirement in the code doesn't require bond. It just says it has to maintain good health for 5 years. If it dies, must be replaced within 3 months or something like that. So it'd be
Sometimes you
more
require
education.
an annual report from the developer ensuring that the trees are still maintained in good
That's
health.
somebody that
But it's
actually
still
does
monitoring,
that.
yeah.
Like,
It's still
I see
Yeah.
us put things in codes too often that we then don't necessarily have a program in place. And then hiring an arborist would be one, but that's still a big job. I mean, we just did the home energy score. There's things that we do that we have to follow through on and make sure that we have staff to do it.
So are you
So-
saying it is outside of the scope of this?
No, I'm not
program?
saying I'm just saying if we're gonna put it in there, I wouldn't advise us putting in there unless we've also had the discussions on how is that going to be enforced and followed through so that we really do it. We don't want to say we're gonna do something that.
Do we have like
yeah.
the expertise to do that? Like to make sure like that we can hire more staff, say, or how would we go about that as a committee, I guess?
So I guess the examples I've seen haven't required more staff. It's just says the trees have to stay alive for 3 years or 5 years. And I can pull up the exact language. if it dies, then you have to replace it. My guess is a neighbor's going to see it die, call the city and say, hey, I thought this tree was a replacement tree. We go out, you're right, it's gone. Here's your condition, you have to put it back.
Okay. Yeah.
And then the period starts again for 3, I forget how it's exactly written, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
That's for the replacement. I definitely need to work with Mary.
Yeah,
And the
I mean,
attorneys
our
on
current
the
code
preservation.
enforcement, which I guess for a program like this, I'm not sure it's our current code enforcement system is a complaint-driven system. So do we want a system where your neighbors can call you about a tree next door? Or do you want an actual program where you have a way to see how are trees doing? Because in a complaint system works for a lot of cities for sign codes or for a variety of codes. Does it work for trees? Do we want that's just what we have right now is a complaint system.
And there are other layers too, like homeowners associations where you'll get a note if your tree's dying, and then you've got to deal with it anyway. So it's not solely on staff, but it is, I think that's something that falls under the comprehensive urban forestry system that should be there in the future, but that the additional if-then statements to write for that is probably more than we can chew.
And there are a lot of funding sources out there for that kind of program, so that would help that issue.
And just to keep us focused back
Yes.
to the question at hand is the mitigation for replacement on site, what Dan proposed. And then the number 2 on the screen.
So are you calling for a vote on that or what?
I'm at some point here, we're gonna need to go around the room and give feedback on that, plus the question about what's the right way to say it? Utility easements and rights of way.
Just to
Include or
clarify
exclude?
on that, the utility easements are not something outside of our right of way in Bend. So we have franchise agreements that allow you to operate. That's one of the reasons we have wider streets for bike ped, and our utility easements are within the right of way. If we went to narrower streets, then we might have utility easements, and some other cities may do this outside the right of way, and those would be separate recorded easements. Now we have franchise agreements to operate, and we're going to go to a right of way code within the right of way. So there just isn't something as what you would consider a utility easement to call out. It's part of the right of way. Just want to be sure you all understand that.
But we have easements.
Yeah,
and
but
tracks and-
right. So, but then if you have a site improvement plan and you have fee simple cottage lots and you have to run water and sewer to all of those, they all have to be their own. They have to be their own thing. So then there are trees that those are impacted on that are outside of the right of way, but that definitely take out trees. So I think that's am I understanding? Sometimes, you're right. Sometimes. I'm just trying to understand the request that Morgan has so I can articulate it for us to go around the room and give feedback on.
Well articulated.
So I think that would be the first question, because if we are going to take that out, then I would recommend we look at the tables again. So if there is interest in looking at taking out streets or right of ways, and I guess I'd have to look at
We talked about arterials and collectors, and not local streets, but that might be,
but if we're gonna do the utilities, they're in all the streets, then it'd be every street. And of our projects, I don't have, well, I guess Poplar was a cottage, so I could use that one to look at deducting the area for utility easements. That just seems complicated, but I'm sure it's on the maps.
Utilities seems a step too far for me.
Well, you can figure out a buildable area of a property, and if it's not buildable, then it's already got something associated with requirements of development on that property that you can't use it for something else.
plus at the time of site plan review, some of those utility locations change. So it's not 100% set with the plan set we're reviewing at that level.
Would there be a percentage typical, I'm just asking the civil engineer,
A percentage of,
of a typical site that is usually dedicated to right away, like 10% or something?
if you're doing a subdivision, it's around 20.
That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
But a lot of these sites we're talking about don't have any right of way, or they're just an apartment site plan. That site plan, they just started some apartments there on Simpson for the, and they cut down all the trees up there. I saw that, and that doesn't have any right of way going in. They're just putting in like 3 or 4 buildings. And the way you set that up, I guess. Well, that site worked out. Are you working on that site? It looks like there's a nice piece of property on the north end or on the west end where you can save those trees. Works out pretty good.
Our property doesn't go all the way to Mount Washington Drive. That's
Oh,
a
interesting.
different owner. Yeah, where the six fences up, that's the end of our property. There was just so.
Both sides of the road though, right? Both sides of the,
Rooted Homes is on the west side and Housing Works is on the east side of 18. So we.
so you don't have any housing over there. What do you got over there?
40 single family homes. Yeah, on 3 acres.
How many trees are getting cut down there?
I forget how many we cut down. Yeah, don't know.
And that's a subdivision with streets being built in it?
Technically, it's a subdivision, but it's a land trust, so the land is all owned in common, even though there are imaginary lot lines.
So it's more like a cottage
Cottage.
development, and I think
Right.
it was 23% was preserved on site. It was,
Is that what we did? Wow. That's not bad.
well, but you had that pit area that had a number of trees.
We did, yeah.
And yeah, I'd have to look at that one, but
There were some public street frontage improvements, but we're sort of deviating from.
That's a site plan application.
Conversation.
But that's a site plan application for that project, because it doesn't have any, there's no land division.
It was a land division.
a cottage
There's a
house,
land
think
division.
of it as,
Are you creating lots or?
yeah.
You are creating lots.
And there's
Oh.
But
utilities,
not
so
like
you'd
your
have to look at
typical, yeah,
easements.
where there's roads running through the subdivision.
Whereas we just look at the property as a whole and say 20% or 25% without trying to have the planners, or I guess the applicant, submit their easements and their roads and take out those trees.
Yeah.
But you're gonna know that at time of application, I mean, before you even have it reviewed yet, so. I think Sarah brought up talking about master plans maybe differently than some other things. When you're talking about a site plan, you're talking about a commercial development, an industrial site plan, and then talking about a full 40-acre subdivision. These are completely different projects. And they shouldn't fit in the same box. They won't fit in the same box.
Can I ask a probably dumb clarifying question? You're talking about like the buildable lot area.
Right.
What would be the reason to take down a tree outside of that?
A house in a subdivision.
But that would be on the buildable lot area, right?
Right.
Outside. the-
Outside of a buildable lot area, what would be a reason to take a tree down?
Outside of it,
Could be grading, depending on where it sits on the lot. So if to save it or if it's sunken, just the cost of, saving it. So
So that's outside of the buildable
Right.
lot area.
And again, remember, if you can't save it, then you can replace on site or pay in lieu, which is what we don't have today.
I keep reminding myself too, as I'm thinking through each one of these, is that we're gonna make a decision and then we live with it for a year, and if it doesn't work, we can adjust.
we're gonna, right.
Maybe
So-
we keep it really simple.
But like in Aubrey Butte, people do site plans in Aubrey Butte all the time. They need to have the water and the sewer line brought up to their house. So that's gotta go, maybe go around some trees or something to save those trees. You gotta contain stormwater, so you're gonna not put a dry well on your property. You're gonna put a couple of swales on your property. So those swales are always gonna take out a couple of trees somewhere. And they gotta be on the low side, so they gotta be lower than, you can't just go anywhere, they gotta be on the low side. And then almost every property, at least on the west side of Bend, a lot of it on the east side too, is gonna have some kind of retaining wall going on as well. So all those things are gonna take out some of the trees. We're talking about some of these west side lots, you're talking about acre sized lots, you can save a lot of trees anyways. But when you're talking about tight properties, 5,000 square foot lots or less, you're not gonna have those opportunities.
And the way that we're drafting this code would just apply to site plan review and land division. So that is the bigger stuff. That's the multifamily and the commercial developments, industrial developments and land division. So we're trying not to get into the,
Individual
the individual or duplex, quadplex projects.
So we are gonna talk about lot sizes. I think and, on the smaller end, some sort of an exemption at a size that we'll need to work on. But I think in order to try to get mitigation a little closer to putting it in the oven to bake, I'd like to keep talking about this conversation to get everybody's thoughts on it, so we can give Pauline some guidance coming out of today's meeting. Karen.
I had a question about the replacement options. You say you have a tree larger than 14 inches and you're going to replace it 1 for 3. How much financial incentive is that really? I mean, because those little three little trees surely don't cost that much. I'd be inclined to take out the 14 incher and just put in 3 little trees. Wouldn't that be monetarily much ahead to do that?
I mean, it depends, but say 3 trees, probably in the ballpark of $2,500 or $3,000. When you get the cost of the tree and planting it, irrigating it.
Let's see, Covey.
Yeah, I just have 2 questions because I feel like we're still talking about 2 topics at the same time. And I just want to make sure, like, I'm happy to move on to on-site replacement, but I just want to make sure we've covered the other piece of it. I do keep going back to the data that has been provided because I feel like I'm trying to make the decisions based on the data we have. And I'm hoping that's somewhat, it's not going to be representative of every development, but it gives a general picture. And knowing that we're already meeting 5 out of 8 developments are already meeting it, have met the code that we're going to be proposing, and the other 3 don't have to do a lot of work to meet it. I feel unless there's significant reason to open up this whole box of right-of-ways and arterials, if there is significant benefit and reason to do so, and it's better to do so, I'm open to hearing that, but I don't want to go that path unless that's proven or shown, and there's support from everybody here. Otherwise, I would like to move forward with this. And then the second piece of that is, again, from my perspective, knowing that the 20% is already met, again, by the majority of developments already happening. And part of our task is to try to preserve more larger trees. I just wanted to double check and make sure there's consensus on those numbers, the 20 and 25, and there's not interest in 25 and 30. Because based on that, I think I would also be interested and curious about, it says larger than 14. And I think I guess one thing I'm just wondering is if we are using priority trees as 20 inches, should we have a 4th category of 1 to 4 for 20 inches and above, just to provide a further incentive to really try and preserve those and make it a disincentive to cut those? So a couple things there.
Good notes. I think that's a good, I guess, what I'd like to do is go around and get feedback on those 2 points. Should we open up the right-of-way utility, whatever we're going to call that discussion? And then also on this concept of, based on the trees that got removed to make up the remaining DBH, whatever the percentages of that second group is, if it becomes a hybrid, then we go how you'd like to see this go forward.
Can I ask
So-
one question to inform around the table? And maybe just Kathy and Dan, because you have experience with a lot of different communities' codes. What, like you mentioned, Eugene exempts, right, in the right of way. So how, is that the norm or is it the exception from both of your experices?
Mine's it's an exception. I mean,
They don't
usually
accept.
not addressed now. But I do think because we're opening up an alternative path, perhaps we keep it simple for the just do it this way, and then leave it up to the developer if they want to do the extra work to document all of the right-of-way stuff of making that approach, so that it doesn't have to. We don't have to model another city necessarily. Maybe we keep it simple, but give an opportunity for another path should that make a lot of sense to do. Because it's going to take money and time to document all that. So.
And Eugene's codes preservation standards are 40% or 50%.
Yeah, I knew it was higher.
Also, another follow-up question, what's the Eugene Urban Forest staff look like? Do they have a city staff?
Yes.
Okay.
As a developer, there's two cities we stay away from in Oregon. Eugene and Portland.
Okay, so I'm gonna start with Eric, and I would like to hear your thoughts on this tree replacement. And if you have additional thoughts on the right-of-way question, I'd like to get your thoughts as we go around the room.
Yeah, I think that all trees that are located within an area that's right of way or utility easements are should not be counted, and that should apply to not just collectors and arterials, but also locals. So as far as tree replacement, I think I'm wondering why we go. To me, I've worked under when you're developing the land and you're going to be placing more things on the land, you don't have as much land left. Why would you replace at a higher number than what you've removed? I like a number that's like the opposite. 3 for every 3 trees you remove, you replace with 1.
So I kind of think it might be more helpful first, I mean, to ask the right of way question, because if we are going to change it to looking at right of way, then
That's fair.
these numbers change too.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll revise the question for a quick around the room on rewind and look at the numbers excluding right-of-way trees and start that discussion. Those words even make sense.
Is it a discussion or just a weigh in?
It's a we're straw poll of the group to weigh in on that issue, and then we'll decide where to go forward from there. We just heard from Eric. Chris.
So I think we should just keep it simple. I think Dan kind of mentioned, when the cities that does allow that, they have a large infrastructure, or they have a large urban forest of staff. As of right now, kind of, sorry, the attorney, the state for your name. Mary.
Yeah.
I pointed out, I just don't think we have the infrastructure to really look at the nuance. Corey had mentioned, and I've been an arborist for 12 years and I'm still figuring out trees. They're very complicated. One code, it's not a one size fits all. There's sometimes where you can develop near trees and alternative designs, or sometimes whether it's the bedrock or grading issues. There's so many different variabilities. And if we don't have a city arborist who's kind of looking after the city's natural assets, and if as of right now, the way that the tree code and bend is, all you need is a qualified professional to assess the trees, and anyone can call themselves a tree expert. Until we change that to certified arborist, until we get a urban staff or an arborist on the city staff, I don't think we can really address those issues very fairly or intelligently at all. So I think it's better if we just keep it just one way and not consider streets, utilities, etc.
Karen.
So it's a question that when you're looking, for example, at the total DBH of the property, you would exclude the DBH of the trees that are sitting on the proposed right of way.
Right.
Do I understand that?
That's the question.
Well, I think that when you look at the property, every tree should count, and the design should start there. You've got a formula, you've got to meet that formula. And that means that the arborist comes in and takes a look at what grading has to be done, what problems you're going to encounter. And you start the design with the formula in mind.
Keep it simple. Keep it how we had it before. 20%, don't cut the roads.
I thought you were including the right of way in the numbers that we've looked at already. Or no, you were not including the right of way.
It's the property as a whole, so it would include their proposed right of
The
way.
proposed road.
Yeah.
Okay,
So the trees on the entire site.
got it. Yep, so I would second what Karen said. We have to include the trees.
And that's what you said too, Corey, right?
No, I said
No.
do not include the trees.
Oh, do not, so not do
No,
not.
I mean, we've just done all the math on, I know it probably surprises people. We've already done the math and kind of figured it out, right? Otherwise, we're starting back over again.
It's
No, no, it says it.
You're saying keep it the way we've been looking at it?
Yes.
Which is what Karen said and what Gina said.
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
They're all
Okay.
saying the same thing. Yeah.
But that means the
Different ways.
trees that are in
Yes
the
or no.
right of ways are included in the inventory. Okay, cool.
Yeah, just make sure.
Same words.
Keep it simple.
Simple.
Also keep it simple and kind of second what Karen and I think Chris especially pointed out. I do want to put the caveat, and especially if this is something for reviewing in a year from now, or if that's a suggestion, is I do like having it be more precise of like counting and looking at what's within the control of developers. And so if it makes sense, not necessarily for this, but maybe like a discretionary thing where it's like if they're looking at just those trees and they want to do 50%, maybe have it as an option. If that gives more flexibility and makes it possible. But I don't want to make it more complicated either. So I'll still, I'll just say keep it simple, but maybe come back to it if it makes sense to look at that again.
Yeah, I think the percentages we're at right now account for the right of ways being included. If we did want to include them, you know, we'd be doing the same thing in a different way, I guess, by just increasing the numbers because of that. So I would say stick with what we have.
I second.
Yeah, I'd keep it simple. They will still have the option to go down a discretionary path, correct?
Well, the discretionary path right now is going to do if they want to not include unhealthy trees. That would be the discretionary path. If we do a discretionary path for them wanting to deduct the utilities and easements, I suppose we can do that, except it's not going to be 20 and 25%, similar to Gene.
If it's discretionary at that point, would it be? Would it still be discretionary? Like, I'm just imagining a site where it's complicated enough that we're like, we can do these things, but we can't do it exactly per the three main options. We'd like to go this route.
Yeah, give them two options.
Yeah.
Either you just do this, and you just want to go straight 20%, 25, or you want to submit the additional information.
Discretionary.
And that it may not be 100% discretionary. It's just either you're going to include the property as a whole at 20 and 25%, or you're going to provide information showing the right of way and the easements, and the percent to preserve is higher because you're counting a lot less trees.
Okay, yeah, but for this discussion.
Okay.
So what you just said, you know, keep it simple, but there's an opportunity if it made sense for a developer to provide additional information and ask for something different.
Okay.
Shockingly. So I think just keeping in mind that we really have to be aware that the developable sites are weird ones like Gina's, where you've got a whole bunch of it that's just not buildable regardless. So I appreciate what Sarah mentioned earlier about the distinction between a larger master plan community and a smaller infill project. So I think that if we can make an area distinction, I would recommend that under 3 acres that public city, let's say public requirements are exempted. And just to note that is also in alignment with the recommendation that has come from HPAC as well. They're actually a little more, let's say, higher standards because they also include grading, topo, additional factors like that. So it's, I'm glad to know that Eugene and Portland have already taken this into consideration, but this is likely to be taken into consideration again, statewide.
The 48 inches or greater.
Exempting public, any public requirements as well. Not just rights of way.
Right.
Okay, I'm inclined, I would prefer to exclude it, but I think that probably is falling under the discretionary path. I'd like to see a discretionary path for those unique situations where the clear and objective puts you into some Frankenstein version of compliance with the code, but that doesn't also require Pauline to have 7 assistants. Doing all those things at the same time. Okay, so the message I'm getting is steady as we go with the mitigation based on the denominator of total DBH that we've been working under to continue to move this toward recommendation. And I guess I would remember that we've got this whole side list that we've definitely stipulated of urban forestry engineering standards, rights of way, all of those things, but also that we're going to come back in a year and we can give two options to council. If there's something that we simply don't come to an agreement on, I don't mean two options that are completely fully fleshed out, but it's more like, okay, these are the things. And on this one, we had an alternative path that we talked about that you might consider. So now that we're talking about the ratios of trees, would that be the next thing? Covey's going to ask a clarifying question.
Yes. Just before we get into that, I just wanted to double check because Pauline shared those numbers at the after the last meeting or after we voted the last meeting, and knowing kind of just once again reiterating that the actual preservation for the 8 properties in terms of priority trees was 33 trees. With the 20%, if we rounded that up and we went to all the developments, did the minimum, it would be 29 trees that we preserved. If you did 25%, it would be 37 trees, rounding it up as well. If you want to if you're able to break the slide up, Pauline, just previous one to this.
Oh, the actual trees.
Just knowing this information, because I don't think we had it as clearly available when we did the last round of voting. I just want to see if there's any support for going from 20% for priority and 25% for DPH to 25% for priority and 30% for DPH to actually preserve some large trees, or at least go in that direction, knowing that we will still then have options for mitigation with on-site replacement and fee in lieu. I just want to put that out there in case there's support to see if there's support for a little bit higher numbers, because they go in.
Yeah, I'd like some feedback because I've been thinking about, do we need to move into the ratio conversation and then say, okay, now we're going to zoom back out and we're going to look at the percentages and the way it would apply along the way. And that's why it was just basically a straw poll to say, all right, this is what we're leaning toward, but we knew we needed to have a replacement conversation. So now we're having part of the replacement conversation. Maybe Pauline and Renee, what would you prefer us to give you guidance on? Would you like to talk ratios now, or Covey's question is, do we go back and see if anybody's changing their minds on the 2025 that we penciled in after the last meeting?
I think if I would just ask to go around, is there interest to revisit a vote on the percentages? If it's no, then we go into mitigation. If it's yes, then we figure that out, because that might change what the mitigation ratios look like. Because if we're going to require a higher percent of the DVH, then maybe the mitigation will go up.
Yeah, okay. Interest in revisiting the 20 and 25% straw poll we did last time?
I don't think you're.
No, I don't think so.
I have interest in incentivizing larger trees by giving them a double. A 20-inch tree equals 40 inches towards DBH, which is a different conversation.
Well, I think that works if more so if we're trying to incentivize larger trees, we keep the percent at 20%, but we bump the overall DBH to 30.
Yeah,
Because then you get a lot of credit for saving the larger trees and less mitigation.
okay, so yes.
You'd say 20, 30 with the double count for large trees.
But I don't get to vote, so.
Oh, that's right.
I didn't just vote.
Well, I'll pick that up then and say I would choose that.
Yes.
I was gonna guess that. I didn't write it down ahead of time though. Thoughts, Sarah?
I was just, sorry, can I just say, I think to accomplish part of our task, I think it feels necessary to do that. Otherwise, I feel like we're not preserving more trees as part of the code we're gonna come up with if we stick at 20%. At least that's my perspective.
Got it.
I don't have an opinion on opening it up or not, but to Sue's suggestion of giving more credit to the larger trees, I would just add that they are documented to be in good health. Otherwise, it's just gonna die.
Yeah,
And potentially that it is bonded for, rather than bonding for the full site or something to ensure that it actually survives.
No, I just did the math. I'm data driven. If you take out the two developments that Corey suggested might be outliers, our preservation standards would be higher than what was meant on that.
I'm not sure.
He was suggesting that the two of the developments were outliers. So if you take those out, our preservation standards at 20% would be higher than what is up there.
But are they outliers
I
if
think-
we want this to apply more to master plans?
Well, I think there's a discussion about excluding them anyway, but
I think for now, let's just go with the yes or no part, but heard, both of you. Gina,
I'm gonna say no too, because I mean, the reality is, as a developer, like, you save what you can save based on what makes sense for the development, and we may or may not be saving trees, we may choose to mitigate, right? Like, so, yeah, I think if we have the standard that drives, and they have to comply with it now at this point, or pay, then the chances are that we would actually end up with more than 33 trees with a 20% standard, because those developers who were saving more than 20% would still save more than 20%, and then you've got a couple people who are kind of catching up, paying attention. So I'm good with 20%.
okay,
Yes. I didn't get to vote last time, so yes.
you just voted twice. No, I'm kidding.
sure, was it 3-1?
No, not for me. Okay. Okay, so the straw poll, I also am not in favor of revisiting the percentages. So that would, the group is saying no to going back to revisiting the percentages. Reminder to the group that we haven't really officially voted on, are we sending this forward yet? These are the mini steps that we get to have something full to look at. No to mitigation, yeah. And in 8.5 minutes, Corey's gonna storm out. Remind everybody.
So I think what we would be looking at is just getting if there's support or no support for number 2. The only change I heard possible as a recommendation is 14 inches to 20 inches would be 1 to 3, and then 20 inches or greater would be 1 to 4.
This is based on Eugene's.
I'm not sure which city I got this one from. Every city's replacement, I mean, there's so many different numbers and ratios. And then if you don't want to replace on site, then you pay the fee in lieu.
Can I vote first since I gotta go in a minute?
Yes.
Is that what we're doing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, my only
With
comment.
some color commentary.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, my only comment, 14 inches was kind of random to me because it's not any other dimension that we're talking about. Like, so I'd actually be in favor to say 6 to 10 would be 1 to 1, 10 to 20 would be 1 to 2, and anything over 20 would be 1 to 3.
Simplify it.
Say those numbers again, Corey, sorry.
So 1 to 1, and then 10 to 20 would be
1 to 2.
1 to 2, and then anything over 20. I mean, you could do, if you wanted, 20 to 30, 1 to 3, and over 40, and that's a big tree. So it's really 1 tree per 10 inches, basically.
So is this saying that under 6 inches doesn't need to be replaced?
Right, because we're not even inventorying those. Right. So Corey, I like that because I don't know where I got 14 either, but I would recommend, so as we go around the table, Corey's recommendation or breaking it down a little further and doing the 20 inches would be a higher. But I don't like the 14 because it's random.
Could I just speak to that real quick? So I don't know where this came from, but I feel like if we made that change, that's also done. For right now, trees more than 14 would be 1 to 3, and then trees between 14 and 20 would then still be 1 to 2. So we're actually kind of also make kind of watering.
You want to
that
push the
part of that
ratio.
too, Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to note that.
Okay. So I'm trying to just word this the right way. Let's go around the room and talk about the ratio. You know, we might, does everyone understand Covey's and Corey's 2 takes on it? Okay, so that might be the way to go. There's sort of, what's that?
I can put that up. Um, Just to help.
Typing for audience is the most fun.
I know. So this would be, luckily you don't really have to spell anything.
Gets the red squiggly on
Yeah.
there, which is super stressful.
I have a lot of
Yeah.
those. Sometimes I can't figure out what I'm trying to type.
Let's see, I'll start with Eric. Are you clear on, or, I mean, you can certainly say, I have a third, idea. That's allowed.
Well, I'm not sure about where would these trees be placed? Where would we be putting these?
P and fee instead.
No,
No, where would you put these replacement trees?
We decided we can count street trees, so we can do that.
We did not.
You can put them someplace else in the city or you can pay a fee.
So you put them on your site.
Yeah, you don't have.
Or is that
to.
good?
No, I mean, the idea is to put them on site. Where would they
You
go?
can, just maybe in areas that after the site's graded and you've got your utilities.
But like
built
if you're
in,
doing this in an
there's-
apartment site, you've got the entire property is covered with a building, a parking lot, utilities, or your required open space.
So if you don't have room, then you pay in lieu
Pay the
instead.
fee.
If you don't have your 15% open space?
No, if you
You
don't.
don't have room to replace the trees.
Yeah, so let's say, Eric, you have a project and it requires 7 replacement trees and you just have nowhere else to put them. So instead of placing them on site, you would pay an in lieu fee and the city would take that money and we would put that money towards trees elsewhere in the city.
So the ratio, I'd be looking for the smallest ratio there could be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can you blow it up a little bit?
Oh, yeah,
Easy.
let me put it from the current.
Thank you, Eric. Good question. Chris.
I mean, I'm obviously trending towards, more trees. I would go with a higher ratio. The one thing I would change to is the 10.1. I would just make that an even number because not everyone's gonna have like a logger's tape and do it to the 10th place. But in general, I think this falls in line with what, because again, I think the biggest thing we're trying to do here is in accounting, we're trying to line out and equalize our natural assets for the city. So a larger tree is gonna have more benefits. And so to replace that, so you're gonna have to have more trees to replace that. Just a few quick numbers too. It takes 3 to 5 years to establish a tree. And it takes what they say about 25 years to get maximum benefits out of a tree. And so even if you're, removing a large tree, then that's, replacing forest, that's like 100 years worth of growth that needs to happen to equate to the benefits of that large tree. And so I think it seems fair. But I like,
The higher ratio.
yeah.
Is there a typo? Because you
Yeah.
have 14
Yeah.
and
It should be
20
20.
is what, yeah.
So that would be 14.1.
Yeah.
Because you can't have 14 and.
It'll be in the code, in the proposed code, it'll be written like densities are written, right?
It's the
So you
line
just
below
have to
that.
have a
It's
discrete.
the line
column.
below that, larger than.
Larger than-
Oh, that should be 20.
Yeah.
Okay, Karen.
I think the goal should be to encourage the preservation of larger trees. And that again comes down to a matter of cost, which I don't know anything about, but I would go with a higher ratio because it will hopefully cost less to keep the tree than it would to put in new ones. So I'd say higher ratio.
Corey already voted. Gina?
I
Not voted,
te-
expressed.
Yeah. I tend to agree with Karen, and I feel like the on-site replacement really does go hand in hand with that fee in lieu, and so I think it'll be important to see what that fee in lieu ends up. I also like what Corey said. I would kind of be inclined to go with the top group of bullets, but add a 4th bullet. So do 20 inches to say 36 inches. And I only picked that because I feel like it's 3 feet. Like I think people think of 3, like, I don't know.
Or maybe you guys,
And then-
somebody put on there the 1 inch for every 10, or 1 tree for every 10
10
inches.
inches.
Maybe that's
Yeah.
simple.
Something, yeah.
Oh, right, yeah, yeah. Well, I was just gonna say, I would do another category like larger than 36 inches and do 1 to 4. 1 to 4 trees.
So you're right in the middle.
Okay,
Oh my God.
Yeah, I like the, basically every 10 inches, 1 tree simplifies And it could be expanded to larger trees, could be 30 or 36, but I just prefer the upper three options.
Okay, so then
Yeah.
maybe 20 to 30 is the 1 to 3. and
Becomes,
then-
or even becomes 1 to 4.
Yeah, beyond. But beyond. In Corey's example,
Yeah,
beyond
for
30.
anything
and
larger
24.
than
Yeah,
ends up being.
yeah, greater than or equal to is the final
Yep.
line on that, okay. Let's see, Sarah, did you,
Yeah, I want to incentivize the larger trees being preserved first, if that's an option. So I have the second set of bullets.
Yeah. I'm actually processing that new option that I feel like I'm hearing about the per inches, because I feel like if we're doing it that way, we don't have to correlate it with the trees removed. We're just looking at how many inches are removed and planting trees based on that. Am I
Yeah.
understanding it correctly?
Yeah.
And that would automatically, if you're cutting down a 40-inch tree, you're automatically gonna have.
then
to
that would
plant
fall
more
into whatever
trees
category it's in and then has a
based on
ratio
the
tied to it.
inches. So it does prioritize big
Based on the
trees, and it
inches
keeps it
removed.
simpler too.
Mhm.
So I think I'll be in support. Are there any downsides, I guess I'm missing?
Well, no, it just goes back to Dan's calculation. Remember, 'cause we don't know what trees we're cutting down. We're gonna work from the largest to the smallest. So yeah, if your calculation, your largest tree on site happens to be a 40-inch.
Yeah.
And then you start working your way down to get to the number that you are correct.
Yeah, I guess, just to make sure I answer correctly, if you totally cut down 100 dBH of trees, but plant 10 trees, it doesn't matter. You don't have to correlate them to which trees were cut. You already know you have to plant 10 trees. Are you skipping the whole?
I mean, I think it's more trees for the larger the tree is. And the increments are set at the size of the trees that did get removed, is the discussion. What Pauline showed us at the beginning was 98 dBH removed, 9.8 trees replaced. But as we've gone around, the ratio is different than that because this is the larger the tree removed, the more replacement trees would be required.
The more expensive it becomes,
Okay.
Yeah,
right?
which, yeah.
Yeah, maybe I'm missing why, but I guess I'll go for option 2 based on my confusion right now.
But it's okay, because you proposed the option 2, so you have that.
I did.
Yeah,
So I guess if the bullet we're not seeing that we're talking about is everything over 20 inches and over is 1 to 4. And in Cubby's example of like a insane, 90-inch tree that whatever, but the replacement would be 4 trees because it would max out at the 4.
I think that's the point.
If we're only
Instead of
going,
9.
yeah. So if we don't keep incrementally like going up, then we
okay.
just, after 20 inches, it's kind of all the same, which is just a consideration. But I think that if we wanted to really incentivize the 20-inch, like maybe just doing the top ones, but changing that to 1 to 4, the last bullet, to like make it more of a jump. But then keeping numbers that we're using, so it's less like random with the 14, so.
Okay.
So if there's.
So we need like 1 to
option-
1, 1 to 2, and 1 to
1 to
4.
4, yeah.
Correct.
Okay,
Oh, so
Yeah.
and
One
eliminate
to
the
3.
14-inch
Yeah.
thing, it's
Yeah.
confusing.
1 to 3 becomes 1 to 4 in the top one.
For 20 inches or more?
Yeah.
Got it.
Are you?
Yeah, but
I
I
kinda like
didn't
that too.
just vote.
Okay.
I don't know if I'm changing my vote, but I like that. I guess the one question I have is, if I can just quickly ask the arborist maybe, or folks, is how many trees are greater than, let's say, 30 inches? Is that common?
In town.
it's totally site dependent, but I have a 48, 38, and 2 36s.
I'm just
Ponderosas,
wondering if,
you know.
again, not to complicate more, I wonder if it makes still more sense to.
It's totally site dependent,
More than
because I was
30
on a
inches.
site yesterday that's all juniper. And they only get to, I mean, they're all the same size and they're totally different heights, right? So it's a totally different thing versus ponderosas versus some of these really old maples that are a handful of around town. So I think they're just really totally site dependent. And we don't have a total tree inventory where we could say, where's the bar at which we say, if we did, that would be awesome, a GIS thing, or like, boom. This is where you get the most juice for the squeeze. So Christy, got you Sue
Non-voting.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry, I was confusing my straw poll versus.
Christie and Sue are going.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I expressed mine.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I like where Christie and Sue are going. I think the 3 bullets to keep simplicity, but yet the last bullet changes from 1 to 3 to 1 to 4 to incentivize larger trees.
Yeah, and that would be my opinion as well. So the 3 bullets, but change the last bullet to 1 to 4.
Right. Morgan?
Pauline, quick clarifying question. Are the trees that are required for the parking lot canopy counting towards mitigation?
Required trees will not count towards mitigation.
No, 1 to 1, please.
So I would say, it looks like the recommendation by Covey and Christie, the 1 to 1, 1 to 2, and then 1 to 4. Oh, Jeff. Would you like?
I like the way Corey proposed it. The 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 1 to 3, because we've already lowered the largest tree DBH. We've already lowered what we're adding, what we're counting. So we're increasing the denominator in both of those cases. So I think the simpler 1, 2, 3 is appropriate. Although I know that's not on the majority.
Mhm. Okay, so for the sake, I just want to get through one more slide to give you something to think about.
Sorry, just for records, I want to make sure, I think my vote is still for number 2. I think it ends up preserving more trees. Because you already have 1 to 4 for more than 20. And then 14 or 20, you have 1 to 3, which
So you
if
have
I'm-
1 to 1, 1 2, 1 3, 1 4.
yeah, for option 2 still.
Okay, so that is the majority. Because I have Chris, Karen, Covey, and Gina. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. For next meeting, which I'll send out a doodle poll, we didn't get through it today. I just want to highlight these questions for you to think about, because we're going to talk about this at the next one. Oh, yes, thank you. I can see it perfect. I forget. So a couple of questions for the group. And I heard a lot of this today about some sites are just going to be too small to put trees on site. So one thing for you to think about, is there a development site that should not be subject to those preservation standards? Is it a ½ acre? Is it an acre? I think Morgan said maybe 3 acres. If it's yes, then we need to decide what is that size that is not going to be subject to saving any % of trees on site. The second question is, if it's yes, should they still be required to mitigate? So they don't have to save any trees on site, but do they still have to mitigate, maybe replace on site or pay in lieu? So that's the first thing you need to think about for the next meeting. And then the second one, we kind of talked about a little bit at the last meeting, is whether or not, let's say for simplicity, we say an acre or less, you do not have to preserve any trees on site, but an acre and above does have to preserve, and that they can't just come in and clear cut. And so if we looked at, and at the bottom of the slide, something right in front of my 5% floor, would show you the bare minimum that you would have to preserve on site before you can replace on site and or pay in lieu. So that way a developer doesn't go straight to clear cutting a site. They have to come in with 5%. Sarah?
Would this, the minimum lot size apply to the parent parcel in the case of like a subdivision? Because I think the code now says sites under an acre. So as soon as you divide, your sites are under an acre and.
So it'd be the parent site. So if you have a 20-acre site, you obviously wouldn't fall under a exemption of like a ½ acre or acre less. You'd have to preserve the 20 or 25%. But before that 20 acres can come in and totally clear cut, just jump to paying a fee. Is there support or interest in saying you need to at least preserve 5% on site and then the rest you can mitigate for? Or are we going to still allow a developer to not even look at option in the flow chart and just go straight to the end to clear cutting a site? So this is what we'll talk about at the next meeting.
Morgan, HPAC is talking 3 acres?
No, sir, that was my
Oh, you threw that out.
Not for no preservation at all. That was
Right.
just to exempt.
Got it.
Isn't it
public requirements.
6,000 square feet?
That HPAC is.
I know they're talking about something. It's
I think-
on the last
I
draft.
think it's 5.
5,000
acres.
square feet.
I mean, like a lot, so we're not talking about anything that would be.
Because it was at 10, I thought it got down to 6. So basically, any
Yeah,
lot
so-
that's developable, if they have trees that are a certain size, you can just cut them down up to 48 inches, I think. Yes, is what it is.
I'm sorry, I don't know who's.
I don't know if this would be easy data to grab off like Data Explorer if it exists, but just how many infill lots like within the UGB that this would apply to, like what size, like how many of them are 3 acres and under, if that's insane.
We might have that. It might not be completely up to date, like from past inventories that we've done, and some of them may have been developed since then. We'll see if we can get a sense of that. Yeah.
But the site that Sue was concerned about at the last meeting, I did look up that, I think it was 2.5 acres.
2.5.
And I could just offer 8th Street, which Jeff knows, and some of you might know about too. I think it was less than half an acre, and we cut down some trees and the neighbors lost their minds, and like the news was out there and everything. So
So what did you build on it? What type of,
we did 5 cottages
okay.
with parking and stormwater and but we didn't cut down all the trees. There were a bunch of trees actually right like on a property line that we
Yeah.
left, and 3 fruit trees. We left 3 fruit trees.
And how big was it?
It was half an acre. I think
Okay.
it was only half an acre. But if Poplar is half an acre, gosh, 8th Street feels smaller than that. Yeah, so it must have been smaller. I'd have to look it up. Maybe I can look it up and follow up by email. Good, Pauline.
Yep, something to consider, both for constraints on the site based on the size, less flexibility to design around a small site. And then also just where are those sites located, kind of what Christy was getting at. Is it downtown? Is it infill? Is it right where we want development? And should try to be focusing it.
I think Burnham has a vacant parcel layer.
So I'm
I'll look
looking
at
at vacant. I know I complicated too much because there's a lot of things.
There's really
All the day there.
Chris had one real quick. guys.
Yeah, so I was at, as some of you know, I was speaking at our conference, an arborist conference, and there's a lot of excitement in the arborist community. We keep talking about HPAC a lot, but I want to also talk about the infrastructure bill, which is passed. As some of you may or may not know, $1 billion is a fee set aside to be spent towards community forestry. 28 million of that so far is going towards our state of Oregon. The Department of Forestry in Oregon actually has added 2 more full-time staff to their community forester program. And so, I want to applaud all of you guys for doing a lot of good stuff there and trying to bend up to that. And I just want to point out that there is a lot of momentum in trying to make cities more green friendly and putting an emphasis on the green infrastructure in cities. And so while we're very concerned about the houselessness crisis, we're trying to address that. I think there's also, this is not small potatoes as well. And so while we try to balance HPAC, I think there's a lot of money being spent on green infrastructure as well. And so I want to kind of point that out because I don't think that's been said enough in this group.
I got something.
Paid for an arborist at the city of Bend.
That needs to be ongoing money.
I think when we're talking about exemptions, I think we should consider industrial lands as well, because industrial lands you're talking about like the indoor soccer center, that's a rectangular building with a rectangular parking lot on a rectangular lot. This is a different ballgame than you're talking about housing development. I don't think that industrial land should be subject to these type of rules for tree protection. I don't think people have the expectation that trees are going to be protected in the Empire Business Park and Industrial Park than they are on residential lands.
Noted. Thank you. See you next time.
Look for a doodle.
MJ and
Thank you.
about a week ago. Yeah, we were gonna go, but.
Yeah, Corey.